It was supposed to be just another headline-grabbing celeb romance. Another red carpet flash, another power couple the internet could obsess over for a few weeks before scrolling on. But surprise, this breakup wasn't about busy schedules at all. Oh no, everything you've been hearing? Just a sanitized version of a story that's way messier, way louder, and honestly, way more awkward. Here's the real question no one is asking. Why did Stefon Diggs suddenly go radio silent just as things with Cardi B were heating up? And why did Cardi, the queen of oversharing, pull back like someone hit a hidden switch? Coincidence? Or classic damage control? From a picture-perfect public debut to a suspiciously strategic album tie-in, to a breakup so clean it screamed PR stunt, something doesn't add up, and insiders are finally whispering. For the first time, it seems Diggs may have actually revealed what went down. So was this love story real, or were we all watching a carefully choreographed illusion? Stick around, because what you're about to hear could completely change your perspective. The story didn't start with a breakup. It started with a moment that looked too polished to be accidental and too quiet to be honest. When Diggs first appeared with Cardi B, it wasn't chaos. It was controlled, calculated, almost like the headline was written before the cameras even flashed. And that's where the real question begins. Not why they broke up, but what were we actually watching from the start? Look closely, and the signs were always there, not loud, not obvious, but subtle enough to make you pause. Two completely different worlds collided. On one side, a superstar empire built on unpredictability, raw emotion, and saying whatever no one else dares. On the other, a disciplined athlete whose life runs on focus, routine, and zero distractions. How often does that mix survive long term? Exactly. The internet adored it at first. The opposites attract fantasy sells itself. Fans romanticized every glance, every appearance, every stage moment. But what went unnoticed was how meticulously timed those appearances were. Not random, not spontaneous. They were checkpoints in a rollout. Then came the moment everyone still whispers about, the one that didn't just confirm the relationship, it marketed it. A brief visual, just enough intimacy to set social media on fire without a full confession or interview. Because in today's world, visuals don't just speak, they control the narrative. And here's where it gets juicy. While the public celebrated a new-it couple, whispers behind the scenes were growing. Quiet, but persistent. Patterns emerged that no Instagram post could hide, enough to make insiders raise eyebrows. The first sign? Availability. Or rather, the lack of it. Two peak career people. One hopping from performances and studio sessions, the other locked in strict routines with almost zero room for distraction. Now imagine trying to build something real amidst all that. Not just a headline, but something lasting. Fragile things don't trend. Put fragility under a glaring spotlight, and it starts to crack, not explosively, not headline-grabbing, but slow, quiet, only obvious when it's too late. Public appearances faded. Social media interactions dwindled. Energy shifted from look at us to nothing. Silence isn't empty, it's a signal. And according to those who claim a closer view, the issue wasn't just timing. That's the neat, public-friendly story being sold. That's how controlled narratives behave. They build, they peak, and then they fade. Now let's talk about the moment things started to really unravel. Because according to multiple reports, there wasn't one big fight. No dramatic explosion. No single event you can point to and say that's where it ended. Instead, it was something much harder to notice, but much harder to fix. Distance, not just physical distance, emotional distance. The kind that creeps in slowly. The kind that turns long conversations into short check-ins. The kind that makes effort start to feel like obligation. And once a relationship reaches that point, it doesn't need a scandal to end. It just stops growing. And when something stops growing under this kind of pressure, doesn't stay still. It fades. Now here's where the public story starts to feel even more convenient. Because when Page 6 reported that the breakup had already happened quietly, the explanation was perfectly packaged. No drama, no accusations, no controversy. Just the people who couldn't make it work because of their schedules and on paper. That explanation works, but here's what does on single quotes. The timing of that report, because by the time it came out, fans had already noticed the silence. They had already started asking questions. They had already begun piecing things together on their own. So when the official explanation finally arrived, it didn't feel like new information. It felt like a response. And responses are usually designed to control a narrative, not reveal it. So now the question changes again. Not why did they break up, not even what really happened, but something much more specific. What needed to be kept quiet? Because when everything is truly simple, it doesn't need to be managed as carefully. And according to some insiders, the answer might not be one big secret, but a series of smaller truths that when combined, tell a story that's a lot less clean than the one being presented. There are quiet mentions of disagreements about how public the relationship should be. Not arguments you'd see trending online, but ongoing differences that never fully got resolved. One side more comfortable with visibility, the other more cautious, more controlled. And over time, that difference didn't just stay a difference. It became a divide. There are also hints that expectations didn't always match reality. What started as something exciting, new, and full of potential slowly turned into something that required more effort than either side were prepared to give consistently. Not because they didn't care, but because caring isn't always enough when everything around you is pulling in different directions. Then there's a part nobody likes to talk about. Fatigue. Because maintaining a high-profile relationship isn't just about emotions. It's about energy, constantly showing up, constantly managing perception, constantly balancing what's real with what's expected. And eventually that kind of pressure doesn't just test a relationship, it drains it. So when you put all of this together, the differences, the distance, the pressure, the expectations, the idea that this ended because of timing starts to feel less like a full explanation and more like a simplified version of something much more complicated. And maybe that's the point, because complicated stories don't always serve the people involved, but simple ones. Simple ones keep everything calm. They keep everything controlled. They keep everything moving forward without unnecessary attention. But even the simplest stories leave traces of something deeper. And if you look closely enough, those traces are still there. You just have to be willing to see them. And once you do, it becomes almost impossible to unsee what's actually sitting beneath the surface. Because by the time the silence became undeniable, by the time the public stopped asking, "Are they together?" and started asking, "When did this end?" something else had already happened behind the scenes, something final. And according to whispers that have been getting harder to ignore, that final moment wasn't loud, wasn't messy, and definitely wasn't public. It was quiet, almost clinical. The kind of ending that doesn't come from one big argument, but from a realization that's been building for weeks, maybe even months. A realization that no matter how good something looks from the outside, it's not working on the inside. Now, here's where things take an even more interesting turn. Because for the first time, there are suggestions that Stefon didn't just walk away silently. That behind closed doors, there was a moment where he finally said what had been building up this entire time. Not in a dramatic speech, not in a public statement, but in a way that made it clear. This wasn't just about being busy anymore, it was about alignment. And according to people who claim to know how that conversation went, the message was simple, but heavy. Two people, two powerful careers, two completely different rhythms of life, and no real space where those rhythms could meet without one of them having to compromise more than they were willing to. Because think about it, in one world, unpredictability is power. Saying what you feel, doing what you want, showing up everywhere. That's how you stay relevant. That's how you stay on top. And in the other world, discipline is everything. Routine, focus, control. Because one wrong move, one distraction at the wrong time, and everything you built can start slipping. Now, imagine trying to merge those two realities into one consistent relationship, not for a moment, not for a headline, but for something long-term. It doesn't just require effort, it requires sacrifice. And according to these reports, that's exactly where things hit a wall. Because at some point, the question stopped being, can we make this work? And started becoming, what are we willing to give up to make this work? And when both people are at the peak of their careers, when both people are used to being in control of their own world, that question doesn't have an easy answer. Sometimes it doesn't have an answer at all, and that's when the decision gets made. Not out of anger, not out of betrayal, But out of clarity, now here's the part that makes the public narrative feel even more strategic. Because while all of this was happening privately, the outside story never changed. It stayed clean, it stayed simple. It stayed focused on timing, schedules, and mutual respect. And on one level, that might not be a lie, but it's definitely not the full truth. Because what's being left out is how close things may have come to becoming something much more serious. How real the connection might have actually been before reality stepped in and forced both sides to take a step back. And most importantly, how the ending wasn't just about logistics, it was about realization. A realization that sometimes, even when something feels right in the moment, it doesn't fit into the life you're building long term. And that's a hard thing to admit, especially when the whole world is watching. Now let's talk about what happened immediately after, because this is where action starts. Speaking louder than any statement ever could. No. Drama.no, publicfallout.no, messyinterviews.just. Separation, a quiet return to individual routines, individual priorities, individual lives. And if you weren't paying attention, you might have missed it completely, because there was no big moment that marked the end, just a gradual shift back to normal, as if the entire relationship had been a chapter that both sides closed at the exact same time. But here's what makes that even more interesting. The absence of chaos. Because in a world where celebrity breakups are usually loud, emotional, and impossible to ignore, this one wasn't. And that tells you something. That's how a carefully controlled narrative works. It builds, it peaks, and then it quietly fades. Now let's get to the moment things actually started unraveling. According to multiple reports, there wasn't one explosive fight. No headline-grabbing meltdown. No single event you could point to and say, that's when it ended. Instead, it was something far subtler and far harder to fix. Distance. Not just physical, but emotional. The kind that creeps in slowly, turning long conversations into brief check-ins. The kind that makes effort feel like obligation. And when a relationship hits that point, it doesn't need scandal to die. It just stops growing. Under this kind of pressure, nothing stays still. It fades. Here's where the public story starts to feel convenient. When Page 6 quietly reported the split, the explanation was perfectly packaged. No drama, no accusations, no controversy, just schedules didn't align. On paper, it works. But notice the timing. By then, fans had already observed the silence, asked questions, pieced things together. When the official story hit, it didn't feel new. It felt like a response, and responses are designed to control the narrative, not reveal it. So the real question shifts, not why did they break up, not even what happened, but what needed to be kept quiet. Insiders suggest it wasn't a single secret, but a series of smaller truths. Quiet disagreements about public exposure, mismatched expectations, differences in comfort with visibility, all slowly turned into a divide. Add the fatigue factor. Maintaining a high-profile relationship isn't just emotional. It's energy, constant presence, managing perception, balancing reality with expectation. Pressure like that doesn't just test a relationship. It drains it. Differences, distance, pressure, expectations. Suddenly, the timing explanations start to feel like a simplified cover for a far more complicated reality. And then comes the ending. Quiet, almost clinical. Not a dramatic argument, but a realization that had been building for weeks, maybe months. That connection, however real, didn't fit into either life long term. Reports suggest Stefon didn't just walk away silently. Behind closed doors, he finally made clear it wasn't just about being busy. It was about alignment. Two powerful careers, two different life rhythms, no space where they could merge without compromise. One world thrives on unpredictability, exposure, constant engagement. The other demands discipline, routine, control. Merging those worlds, not a moment, not a headline, but a long-term relationship. It requires more than effort. It demands sacrifice. And at some point, the question stopped being, can we make this work? And became, what are we willing to give up? When both are at the peak of their careers, there's no easy answer. So what happened publicly? Clean, simple, controlled. Focus on schedules and mutual respect. On one level, true, but not the full story. The connection might have been real. It might have been serious, but reality stepped in, forcing both to step back. No chaos, no villain, no betrayal, just two people realizing that sometimes feelings aren't enough, timing isn't wrong, and connection alone can't survive clashing worlds. The real shock? How quietly it ended. No drama, no spectacle, just a controlled fade. And maybe that's a part nobody wants to admit. So now the real question isn't just what happened between Stefon Diggs and Cardi B. It's what we didn't see. Bad timing, or a carefully hidden story. Look closer. Because in a world where every move is calculated, every appearance is strategic, and every headline is crafted, how much of celebrity love is actually real? I want to hear what you think. So tell me, was this real love that reality just crushed? Or was it all carefully staged from the start? Did they part ways on equal footing? Or did one of them quietly walk first? Drop your hot takes in the comments because this saga is far from finished. And if you think this twist was wild, buckle up. There's more on the way. Smash that like, hit subscribe, and stay right here. Because the next reveal, it could totally flip everything you thought you knew again.